Alrighty, welcome back to another Interp series lecture video. My name is Xavier Liu. I'm one of the Interp coaches at Bellarmine College Prep. And today our video is all going to be an introduction to original prose and poetry, or OPP. So first of all, what is OPP? Here are a couple event basics for you. The goal of OPP is to write and to perform your own DI or HI. The reason why we classify OPP as a more interp event as compared to a platform event, even though you're writing your own speech, is that OPP is a lot more focused on the delivery aspect. So the performative and delivery of an OPP is a lot more important as compared to OA or OO, where you're focused a lot more on content. In regards to OPP, though, content is still super important. Because you're writing your own speech and not choosing a script, you are required to really think deep about how your characters interact with each other, how to use and write in effective dialogue that moves the plot along. So in OPP, content and delivery are both super duper important. Your OPP can be humorous, dramatic, or both. We recommend that you lean more towards drama, so more so writing a DI with humorous aspects, of course. So you're more than welcome to include funny lines or jokes at the very beginning of the speech. But what we should do is move towards some sort of drama or dramatic moment throughout the course of your speech. Because original prose and poetry includes both prose and poetry in its name, you can have and you can include both prose and poetry, or just stick with one or the other as your entire speech. So you're more than welcome to have prose, you're more than welcome to just have poetry, or you're welcome to use both and experiment with both in your speech. Your OPP should also revolve around a single topic. And what do I mean by this? I mean that your OPP should be focused on exploring one specific idea of one specific topic area. So for example, you could be writing or focusing your OPP on homeless LGBTQ youth, or you could be focusing your OPP on arranged marriages in India, or you could be focusing your OPP on pressures of college students, or police brutality, etc., etc. There are many different topics that you can write your OPP on, though we do strongly recommend that that topic be structured around some sort of theme that you yourself identify with, or you have close ties or connections with. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in this lecture. Your OPP may also have multiple characters, or maybe a monologue. A lot of times, folks tend to include a couple characters in their speech. That being said, you're more than welcome to just have it be a monologue, though we would probably want to have one or two secondary characters in your speech. And then last but not least, your speech should follow the dramatic plot structure. And again, as you learn from English class, that's some sort of introduction or teaser, then some sort of exposition where you lay out what who the characters are, what the characters like, etc., etc. And then you hit an inciting incident, or the main problem or issue that's going to be built up throughout your speech. Afterwards, you'll have a couple scenes of a rising action where the problem starts intensifying, gets more and more problematic before you hit the climax, which is the most intense, the most exciting, the most tense part of your speech. Before you hit the falling action, and then the resolution at the very end of your speech. So your OPP should follow that sort of dramatic plot structure, and we'll go into that in depth a little bit more as well in this lecture. A couple rules for OPP. First of all, the piece must be your own original work. You must write it. Obviously, we're more than happy to help you with that process, right? I, as the coach, your peers, your senior and junior captains, as well as other coaches, are more than happy to help you write your piece. But that piece must be your own original work. You can't copy parts of it from elsewhere and then write the rest. It must be your own original piece. Next, the topic and subject that you write about must be different from years prior. So, for example, if your first speech was all about LGBTQ youth LGBTQ plus homeless youth, your speech next year cannot be on that same topic. So you're going to have to choose something else. So, you can explore poverty, or you can explore, drug addiction, or mental illness, but you can't use the same subject or topic area from years before. You must also cite personalities and have works cited pages for references. So let's talk about works cited pages just for a little bit. If you're including a quotation, you can't quote more than 150 quoted words. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But if you are using any references, or you're using any academic journals, or including any article in your speech, you need to make sure that you cite and have a works cited page for that. In regards to personalities are essentially, characters that are very easily recognizable to the public eye. So, for example, if you choose to write about a character that's sort of modeled after Mickey Mouse, you must cite that personality. And you must note it. For example, when you turn in your script for state qualifiers, you would note that you have one personality, or perhaps however many that you decide to include. So, for another example is if you have a character that's modeled off of a movie or a play, and then another character that's modeled off of like Ellen DeGeneres, you need to cite those personalities in your speech. You must include an introduction. This is also self-written, so you are actually not limited to 150 words, but you should have some sort of introduction explaining what your piece is about, as well as the line, like the title of your speech, and then the line "an original." The "an original" part just basically explains that this is your original speech that you wrote for your OPP. Like I mentioned before, you can't quote more than 150 words. These 150 words can really come from anywhere. So articles, so like CNN, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post. You can also cite from movies. Those also have to be cited. You can cite from TV shows. You can cite from books, etc., right? But you're not allowed to have more than 150 quoted words. Your speech also must be memorized, may not may not exceed 10 minutes, and you're also not allowed to use props. Instead, you're going to be creatively blocking your speech, which is essentially creating the environment around you through your movement and your body language. So, for example, if your OPP takes place in a classroom, you would be moving around desks, or you would be taking books out or sitting down at a desk, etc., etc. So you're going to be using that instead of using props to show what your speech, or to show where your speech is being set up. So what do we do when we start writing an OPP? First of all, what you should be doing is brainstorming several different topics. We recommend that these topics are social justice or identity related, something that you can relate with. So, for example, if you happen to be a part of the Chinese community, right, and right now the Chinese community in the midst of coronavirus is facing tons of backlash and xenophobia. So perhaps something that you might feel comfortable writing about, and might be something that you can explore a little bit more. What you want to be doing is you want to be gathering all these topics, right? Topics about illegal immigration, topics perhaps about like police brutality, topics about student pressures, topics about xenophobia, transphobia, etc., right? You want to be gathering all these topics that you are thinking about. Then you want to start choosing or narrowing down topics, and then developing a specific theme. So what do we want to talk about about this topic. So for example, if you're talking about xenophobia, are we talking about Chinese American xenophobia, self-internalized xenophobia? Are we talking about like being embarrassed by your parents out in public because they don't speak, English that well? Are we talking about other people attacking you? What are we talking about? Develop some sort of theme, right? Afterwards, you want to pick out and start fleshing out your characters. Essentially, what you want to be doing is start drawing out your characters, the setting, what your speech is going to look like, and start outlining dramatic plot structures. So again, those dramatic plot structures sort of go in line with some sort of introduction slash teaser, an exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, right? You want to start looking at those different topics and different themes that you've set up for yourself, and you want to start developing dramatic plot structures. You also want to be focusing on how each character feels and reacts to each other in your speech, right? So once you sort of decide on a dramatic plot structure, you decide on a specific topic and a specific theme, you want to ask yourself, in the speech, how do I want characters to feel? How do I want characters to react to each other in your speech, right? You also want to decide if you're using poetry, prose, or both. Again, you're allowed to use all three. You're allowed to use both in your speech. You're also allowed to just stick with one or the other. That's also totally okay. And then you want to start drafting your OPP based on what you have outlined so far. What you want to focus on is effective dialogue and narration, right? So what do I mean by effective dialogue? At the very beginning of your speech, you're going to be introducing your character or characters. If you have multiple, you want to make that very clear in your speech very early on. What you want to be doing is focusing on how those characters build on each other and how those characters are developing throughout your speech, right? From the very beginning of your speech to the end of your speech, I should have learned something by the time I finished listening to your speech about your characters. Okay. What you want to avoid is like meaningless dialogue that doesn't really get you anywhere. So like, words just like okay or sure, or meaningless sort of phrases that don't really develop the plot of your speech. And you only have 10 minutes to deliver your speech in its entirety. So you don't really want to have any fluff. You want to have a little bit perhaps to like get the ball rolling, but you don't want to have, like 5 minutes of fluff and then just like 3 minutes of really good solid speech. You want to make sure that you move the plot along. You also really want to have good narration. You want to set up your speech such that parent judges aren't confused about what's going on. And narration is a really good way to do this. When we go and like talk about how to block out or again create those surroundings and create the setting for your speech without using props, narration is a really easy way to bring your audience and bring your judge into that setting. You also want to show and tell, right? So like you probably learn in your English class, when you show us something, you're sort of like using very elaborate language to describe stuff, right? You can have that in your OPP, but you don't want to make it too abstract to the point where judges really just aren't getting what's going on, right? So at the same time, you want to make sure that you tell, right? You want to sometimes just be very explicit about what's going on, right? Especially when you get into the climax of your speech. So, for example, if in the climax you have this big fight scene with with one character, you can really just be very explicit about what's going on. You don't really have to get into the weeds of where your partner's arm was placed and what weapon he was holding on to or whatever, right? You can just be very explicit about what's going on. And you want to focus on writing your speech like how you want it to be performed, right? So if you find yourself reading the script over and over again and you realize I would never say this in my performance, then don't write it in, okay? You want to then continue writing and drafting and changing your speech after confiding with your coaches, right? Whether that's me or perhaps like another coach that you're turning to, or your peers or your junior or senior captains. Change your speech, like continue drafting, continue writing, find better ways to word things, make things a little bit more clear when you're writing your script. And then afterwards, once you find and you have a good draft, you want to work with your coaches to start blocking your speech. We would definitely recommend blocking your speech at least a month and a half to even 2 months prior to your tournament, so that you can really just be practicing when you get up closer and closer to your tournament, rather than start freaking out or not having it blocked the week before and like rushing to get stuff in. So we're going to now be talking about the structure of an OPP, which is essentially the dramatic plot structure. I've already mentioned this once or twice, but again, you were going to start off your OPP with a teaser. That teaser is usually around 45 to a minute and a half, or 45 seconds to a minute and a half. You will then have your introduction. Okay, the introduction basically again sort of states what the speech is about, as well as gives the title of your speech and the words quote and original. Afterwards, you're going to have exposition. What a lot of folks like to do is sort of, again, start off or layer in some narration and then go into a particular scene of their speech. So, for example, the exposition could just be you narrating, or it could be prior to you, or it could be you narrating and then jumping into a particular scene. Similarly, you will then hit the inciting incident, which is sort of like where the problem of your speech first gets introduced. That inciting incident, again, can be a scene on its own, right? You would just have a little bit of narration beforehand to set up what's going on in the actual scene itself. Afterwards, you will have the rising action. So again, usually 1 to 2 scenes that sort of build up the speech, and build up the problem from the inciting incident onwards. You will then get to the climax, which is the most exciting, the most intense part of a speech, before hitting the falling action, which is usually 1, maybe 2 scenes that really bring down the intensity from the climax. Again, you might have some narration that jump in from the climax to the falling action, and then perhaps between scenes in the falling action, before finally hitting the resolution, which is how the scene sort of ends out. So what sorts of skills are needed for an OPP? First, you want good writing skills, right? You want to make sure that you have effective dialogue. You want to make sure that you have strong narration, right? Effective dialogue and strong narration help move the dramatic plot structure along, and also help us develop good characters, right? Good characters are super duper important to your piece, and also help the judge and the audience connect with those good characters a little bit more, right? A parent judge is going to find it very easy to connect to a good character that's well developed and very clear and well explained, right? And then last but not least, with these good writing skills, you want to be able to tell us a story. You want to be able to connect with the audience, right? If your OPP is just all about statistics and about very about very specific and granular stuff that just flies over the judge's head, that's not going to be something interesting, or something that's just not going to be something the judge connects with. And then that's going to be very hard. That speech is going to be very difficult to get you a good rank with. So instead, you want to be able to tell us a story. You want to be able to connect us with the audience. You also want to have very good emotional control. Intensity, subtlety, good facial expressions, good emotional portrayal, all of that is super important in your OPP. Okay. With the OPP, you want to make sure that your characters, especially when you get into the climax and the inciting incident, as well as the rising action, falling action of your piece, you want to make sure that they really play off of each other. That as you're getting more intense, as you're getting perhaps like more flustered, more worked up, that's very clearly shown in your facial expressions and in intensity and in subtlety through your facial expressions. Okay, so emotional control is very important. You also want to make sure that the characters that you play are realistic, right? You don't want to over dramatize what you're saying. You want to make sure that everything that you're doing, everything that you're saying is just super realistic. You also want to make sure that you have good characterization, right? Popping versus morphing. So popping is essentially when you change characters by moving your feet very quickly. Usually we use this for a more humorous or more funnier speeches, or during more humorous parts of the speech. Morphing, on the other hand, is used for more dramatic or slower parts. It's where you change characters by moving through larger distances of space. Okay, and morphing is something that you're probably going to use in those dramatic moments of the speech. Dynamic block-in. Because you're writing the speech by yourself and then going on to block that speech, and create that setting for the speech itself, you want to make sure that you have dynamic blocking. So, for example, if you are portraying a specific scene, if you are in a specific classroom or a specific forest or specific gym, whatever it happens to be, whatever the setting happens to be, you want to make sure that your characters are interacting with each other. You want to make sure that the setting is very clearly portrayed, and what you're doing, how you're moving through the speech is very clear. Okay. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that you're very clean with your transitions, your blocking, and your popping and your morphing. Cleanliness basically refers to, when you move between characters or transition between characters or transition in between scenes, whether or not your movements are smooth and clean and crisp, and they don't blend into each other. Usually when you see very bad OPPs or very bad interps, you will have no idea what's going on because their character transitions, their blocking, that's very unclean and very unclear. So with an OPP, you want to make sure that your blocking and transitions, as well as popping and morphing, all of that is very clean, very crisp, and very clear. That's all for this video. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask your coach, that's me, your junior captains, your senior captains, as well as your peers. They're always a great resource to turn to. That's it for this video. We look forward to seeing you next time.